started. So again, welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are bringing this webinar to you today from the University of Arizona and the Office of Societal Impact. We do have unfortunate news that our guest speaker, Susan Renoe, is not able to join us today. She did have a family emergency, so we are so sorry to hear that, but I'm going to do my very best to go over her slides today, and she is certainly someone who is very accessible to reach out to after the fact if you have more questions about her work and about ARIS, but I will cover her slides. So we do have several panelists here today from the University of Arizona. My name is Jennifer Fields, and I am I'm the Executive Director of our Office of Societal Impact, which I will tell you a little bit more about in a moment. But I'll have the panelists introduce themselves.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Higgins. I'm the Associate Director for the Office of Societal Impact, and I'm really happy to be here today.
Morning, everyone. I'm Allison Meadow. I'm Associate Research Professor within the Office of Societal Impact. We're on a roll here.
Good morning. My name is Gigi Owen. I'm a research scientist in the Arizona Institute for Resilience and Climate Assessment for the Southwest Research Program.
So thank you to all of our panelists for being here this morning. Emily, we can move to the next slide. So the University of Arizona is who's hosting this webinar today. The university was established in 1885. We are the state's land grant. That designation happened in 1890. So we do need to acknowledge and want to acknowledge that the university is on the land and territories of the O'odham and Yaqui peoples. And we respectfully acknowledge that, as well as the other 22 federally recognized tribes in the state. And Emily, you can move to the next slide. So we are here, as you heard, many of us from the Office of Societal Impact, and that is an office that is situated under Research, Innovation, and Impact, which is essentially the Vice President for Research's office. The VPR's office is, as it's known as at many institutions. We were established very late in 2019, early 2020. And our mission is to work collaboratively with UA's faculty, researchers, scholars, and practitioners. So that often includes students, staff, everyone who wants to engage in this type of work, but also in partnership with our communities. And we want to ensure that both equitable participation in research and the greatest possible societal impact of University of Arizona's research is realized. So we work with folks to make sure that happens. Next slide. So today, this is just a peek at our agenda. We're going to go through a number of topics. We're going to first start off with what are societal impacts of research. Sometimes when I tell people I'm the Executive Director of Societal Impact, they look at me like, what? What does that mean? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about why it's important to address this now in our work as researchers and working with researchers. We'll dig a little more deeply into the National Science Foundation and the broader impacts criterion, which in many ways was the basis of what's happening now across the research spectrum. We'll share some frameworks for you to think about this work, not only as individuals, but really more as institutions and how you can think about this work, including some details of a pilot test that we ran here at the University of Arizona. We will talk about how the different ways to connect your research to these societal impacts and give you some best practices when you're starting to plan this for an actual project or proposal. And then finally, we'll leave you with some resources that are available to help you as you do this work. Next slide. So we are here just generally talking about research impacts, right? And so for a long time, that was really only considered in the ways that research had a disciplinary impact. It generated new knowledge in a particular field or discipline. That knowledge was often just shared with other disciplinary experts in that field. So we sometimes hear things like, the idea that this research is really honestly too interesting and too useful to just go to a peer-reviewed journal to only be seen by others in your field or your discipline. How do we get it out to the public and get it to have utility for society? And then sometimes when we talk to people who are really deeply disciplinary, foundational researchers, and they have a hard time sometimes connecting themselves to this idea of societal impact. And so sometimes we say, when you first give that sentence, that pitch about describing your research, and ask yourself, so what? Or and get them to continue to dig a little deeper and a little deeper until they really can articulate why society in general should also care about this research and how it can benefit their lives as well. So disciplinary impact often has been measured through things like research dollars brought in, publications, citations, presentations to other disciplinary colleagues, but societal impact really encompasses all of the ways that either the process of doing your research or research outcomes can be intentionally used to create intentional and tangible benefits for society. Next slide. So just to break it down again, like I said, especially when I tell my parents, oh, I'm the director of societal impact now, and they look at me with sort of these blank stares. So I break it down sometimes. So societal, it's really about people, groups of people, depending on who your target audience is. So if you look at some of the words we have on this slide, public, community, collective, shared, common, these ideas that when you're approaching this work and you think about an audience, you're not going to reach every audience, of course, but your chosen audience, how might this work be more intentionally connected with them and to them and benefit a group or society as a whole? Next slide. And then, of course, impact. We're all familiar with the word impact, obviously, in many different ways in our lives. But this idea of having an effect or an influence or an action. So we are really here today talking again about this attention to this and intention. So it's not just, I've heard some folks in the field say a whimpact, like it just happened, but we didn't really mean for it to happen. So we are here today to talk about really how do we do this work so that we're engaging people in equitable ways. We're asking communities what they want and what they need and what their questions are, and planning work so that it really does have an intentional impact on society. Next slide. So if you bring it all together, really we're talking that societal impacts of research are the ways that research and the process of conducting research contributes to society beyond the academic realm. And the reason we include the process of conducting research in that is because oftentimes societal benefits are really around some of the ways you're conducting research, who you're bringing into that conversation and that work in intentional ways, how you might be utilizing your research to build infrastructure for less research intensive universities. So sometimes it's this idea of the process of conducting the research that also provides some societal impacts. And now with the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Allison.
Thank you, Jen. All right. So I think this, talked about, okay, so what is this societal impact? And then we have these big questions about why should we think about this? What is important? The research enterprise, why should we be thinking about these broader and societal impacts of our research? So go ahead, Emily. So I have a few cases to make. Next slide, Emily. All right. The first is this idea of the social contract. And this was an idea, the social contract for science was something that Jane Lubchenco proposed a number of years ago. That basically, her stance was that that society expects two outcomes from its investment in science. And obviously we want the best possible science. But the second is that there should be the production of something useful. And she was tying this to the idea that for the most part, we're using public money for our research. And so do we have a contract, a responsibility to use that money for some direct benefits back to our communities and society as a whole. So that's the idea of the social contract of science. And the next slide, we get a little bit deeper than that. This is, some ideas that Ernest Boyer proposed, again, even before Lubchenco's social contract, was this idea of the scholarship of engagement, and that we sort of have a moral responsibility in higher education. We have a lot of resources, we have a lot of privilege that can be shared. And his idea was that because we have that, it is our responsibility to use that to help improve, to help solve problems in society. So I really appreciated this quote always. Our outstanding universities and colleges remain, in my opinion, one of the greatest hopes for intellectual and civic progress in this country. I'm convinced that for this hope to be fulfilled, the Academy must become a more vigorous partner in the search for answers to our most pressing social, civic, economic, and moral problems. So we've got skills, we have resources, we have a lot to give, and we have some responsibility to be giving back. The next slide. Jen mentioned this already. University of Arizona is a land grant institution, as are, I'm assuming, probably many of yours who are on this webinar. The Association of Public and Land Grant Universities has made a really compelling case for conducting what they call public impact research. And that is, again, building on this land grant mission to benefit the public and research serving public need. And they really us a lot to building and rebuilding trust between our institutes of higher education and our communities, that by going out and working directly with communities on problems that are relevant and important to them, that's how we both have that societal impact and, really importantly, build that trust among the people in our communities and in our states. Next slide. And we are fortunate to start seeing that our funders are really responding to these calls. We're going to get into NSF in just a second, but we've been noticing this trend, and so we've started to pull examples of calls for proposals from many of our funding agencies that are now specifically starting to use the terms, societal impacts, broader impacts, really tying the idea that we want to see this research have direct and beneficial impact. So this is a really nice example from U.S. Department of Agriculture and their Sustainable Agricultural Systems Program. So first, they want to see transdisciplinary approaches in this research, meaning multi and interdisciplinary teams that are also engaging directly with external partners in the agricultural community. And that they want to see things coming out of the proposal, the research that demonstrates that they're addressing current needs, anticipating future social, cultural, behavior, economic, health, and environmental impacts. They want this research to result in societal benefit, very clearly stated in their current calls for proposals. So next slide. A neat example from NASA and their research opportunities in space and earth sciences. They're taking the approach that they want their research to be happening within the context of positive and inclusive working environments. And so they're really laying out some clear guidance of what research teams and institutions need to look like if they're going to be eligible for these funds. So that's another piece of this, right, is changing some of the culture within research and higher education, and NASA is really investing in that. And the next one, really quickly, an example from the European Commission and their research and innovation. They are, similar to what we just saw with USDA. They're expecting anybody funded in their programs to collaborate with directly with research, with the communities that are going to be impacted by climate change. They want community voices in there. They want, they've been involved in the development and testing of all of the range of solutions, and they really want to see that anything that comes out of this fund is developed, tested, and are made largely available. So I think that speaks to this idea of, like, it's too good to sit on a shelf. This has to get out into the world. The next one, Department of Energy, if you are looking at their bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act opportunities, you'll need to have a community benefits plan that addresses how you're investing in the workforce, how you're engaging communities, and how the research is advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and implementing the Justice 40 initiative about who benefiting very directly from our research, and particularly looking at communities that have historically been underserved and marginalized. So their idea is that you see shared prosperity in the clean energy transition, and they're using these benefits plans to enact that. And one more example, next slide, Emily, thanks. Another neat example from Department of Energy are their peer plans, promoting inclusive and equitable research. They really want to see an investment and a clear addressing of equity and inclusion as intrinsic to part of advancing scientific excellence. So the idea that we cannot do science if we are not being inclusive of all scientists and all voices in these efforts. And finally, and we are going to get into the next slide, Emily, we're going to get into more about the history of NSF's work in this area, but I just wanted to kick that off by reminding us all NSF's broader impacts have been criteria have been in place for a long time. And this is NSF's effort to say publicly funded research has tangible benefits to society that go beyond increasing knowledge, and are meant to respond to the question of how does your research benefit society? And with that, I'm going to send it back to Jen because we've got some great additional information about it.
Thanks, Allison. So as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, unfortunately, Dr. Renoe could not be with us today. She did have a family emergency, so I am going to do my very best to cover her slides. She is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research Development and Strategic Partnerships at University of Missouri, but she is also the Executive Director of ARIS, which is an NSF-funded Center for Advancing Research Impact in Society. I am a leadership team member of ARIS, and Gigi and Allison have both been fellows in ARIS. For those of you who have been in this community for a while, you might be familiar with NABI, the National Alliance for Broader Impacts, which was the predecessor to ARIS, also funded by NSF. And Michelle has been to, I think, every single NABI and ARIS, almost every conference of NABI and ARIS since probably, I don't remember, 2013-ish, maybe a little earlier. I was an author on one of their early documents, Guiding Principles to Broader Impacts. So we certainly know Susan well, and we've been involved with this organization for quite some time. Next slide, Emily. So a little bit about ARIS. As I said, it's a NSF-funded center, and it really is meant to amplify the impacts of research for the benefits to society, but it really does this through professional development and has been instrumental in professionalizing the field of BI. Our office would not exist. Our jobs would likely not exist if it were not for the work of NABI and ARIS to really help institutions understand that this is something that funders want. It's not something that every researcher is familiar with doing or comfortable doing. And so putting infrastructure in place to help researchers incorporate this into their work is really important. So they advance scholarship around broader impacts. They create opportunities for professional development, which we'll talk a bit about at the end of the presentation. And they support investigators from very diverse fields and the partners who collaborate with them. You'll hear more about how this work really requires partnerships from Michelle later today. And so ARIS really supports all of that work. And it's funded by NSF. So initially it was really quite focused on NSF's broader impacts criterion. Next slide, please, Emily. So the National Science Foundation, I'm going to give you a tiny bit of history. It was, first established in 1951 and first started awarding grants in 1952. And up until about the mid-1980s or early 1980s, reviewers were asked to use two main criteria to evaluate proposals, which was basically the intrinsic scientific merit of the proposal and the qualifications or the competence of the principal investigator who was proposing the work. And any maybe non-technical type of elements, broader impacts that weren't quite called that yet, were only sort of used to differentiate, like if you had two excellent proposals, that might have pushed it over the edge, but it was not a required review criterion. But in the early 80s, they really wanted to soften the distinction between basic or foundational research and applied research. So they expanded the criteria to 4 criteria. So the initial 2, but then they added criteria around the utility or relevance of the research, and then also the effect of the proposed research on the infrastructure of science and engineering. So that went on for a while, but then in 1996, the NSF really looked at how this criterion was being used and found that the 4 criteria were a little confusing. People were still having a hard time really understanding what was meant by this. And so they started to tighten it and make some sort of categories for impact. And you'll see on this slide that it's really largely been around training and education of teachers and STEM workers, people in the STEM workforce, broadening participation of who's involved in research, enhancing infrastructure and partners to do research, knowledge dissemination and scientific literacy, and then societal impacts that are related to national security and economic competitiveness. So they've always sort of been in those categories, but as the years have gone by and they've studied it more and more, you'll see some tightening around some of that language. So while in the 80s, they talked about broadening participation of underrepresented groups in STEM, now they really are more explicit in the proposal guide to say that they're really interested in the full participation of women, persons with disabilities, and underrepresented minorities in STEM. So you can see how this criteria has changed over time to become more specific and to hopefully help reviewers as they're reviewing proposals better understand what is intended and what's required of this broader impacts criterion. Next slide. So ARIS, back when it was NABI, did a report in 2018 that was kind of the current status of broader impacts. And 5 years later, in 2022, actually realized that it was time to take another look and see how this criterion has evolved over time, what the current status of it is. And it was still pretty clear that while intellectual merit is clearly understood by the research community as well as reviewers of proposal, that the BI criterion still remained a little challenging, not necessarily equally applied in all the different programs and directorates. And not a lot of clear direction to reviewers about what to be looking for as they reviewed proposals. So ARIS convened more than 100 people from the impact community. So that means people from private funders from private foundations. There were people who worked for agencies like the USDA, NIH, other agencies who were there to talk about this work in general. People who consider themselves BI professionals like ourselves and researchers. So a host of people were convened, some in person, sometimes virtually, to talk through how has broader impacts evolved over the last 5 years, and where are there still opportunities to strengthen this criterion. Next slide, please. So some key strengths of the BI criterion came out from these conversations. The first is just this idea of highlighting and prioritizing BI, to have a very specific review criterion that people are asked to be attentive to and address in their proposals, brings visibility and respect for this work. So that's important. The National Science Foundation has made real attempts on review panels to not only include disciplinary experts, depending on the content area of the research, but also to include BI professionals, evaluators, educational researchers, all sorts of other folks who can better help review the broader impacts plan in the proposals, maybe more so than some of the disciplinary experts. So the review panels themselves have gotten better. It's also NSF has really shown their attention to this work by not only funding NABI first and now ARIS, supporting the work of developing some of the tools. But in the following slides, we'll also show how NSF is starting to build programs and directorates around this work. So some of you are familiar with, there's an entire new directorate for technology, innovation, and partnerships, TIP, the TIP directorate. So that directorate, you know, all of the programs, the funding opportunities out of that directorate require these really deep partnerships between researchers and industry and community members, educators, workforce development. You know, all the programs themselves really are asking for this work at the highest level. But there have been other programs that have come out of NSF that also really emphasize this broader impacts criterion in addition to the intellectual merit. We're not forgetting about intellectual merit. That is always a criterion as well, but helping folks to not only understand how to do this work, how to present it in proposals, but by creating these funding opportunities around this work, they are further emphasizing that this is important, that this is something that they take seriously. Next slide, please. And it is starting to have an influence on national policy. We heard Allison talk about how other funding agencies are beginning to adopt this type of work. They don't use the term broader impacts per se. They have different language and different emphases, whether that's broadening participation and creating inclusive environments, involving communities and benefiting communities. But because of the BI criterion and because of the infrastructure that has been built around it, because of NSF's investment, it is influencing policy. And so in a 2023 federal priorities memo from the Office of Science and Technology, OSTP, more inclusive engagement in science benefits the American people, the environment, and the economy. Agencies should invest in making federally funded R&D accessible to the public. Agencies should seek out public participation in R&D programs wherever possible. So this work is really shifting the environment. Next slide, please. So what are some opportunities for both institutions and individuals to strengthen BI? We've talked about some of it, but institutions can develop things like our office. They can hire personnel who have expertise in this area. They can create these centralized mechanisms to collect results of BI. You know, the reality about broader impacts projects is they're different across all projects. So there aren't a lot of common metrics. Again, we'll talk about some frameworks later in the presentation, but institutions can create some frameworks, create some mechanisms to disseminate results, to collect results, and form really collaborative partnerships across the institutions and with important partnerships locally, nationally, internationally. And individuals who are passionate about this work, if you're a researcher, you can seek out BI professionals and BI resources to incorporate that into your proposals. You can talk to administrators at your institution to help them understand that it is important to have professionals doing this work, to support this work, that it's not fair, it's not reasonable to expect disciplinary researchers to know how to do all this work, to do it with great expertise, to have connections to the appropriate partners. So to really push institutions to do this. And then when you are serving on review panels, as many researchers do, really provide substantive feedback on the BI, or ask others on the panels who have more expertise for their opinions, and move the conversations away from strictly the intellectual merit, but to really think about BI very robustly. Next slide, please. And I know you can't read the text on this, but there is a link if you have interest, but I just wanted to highlight that right now the National Science Board is reviewing both of the merit criteria for NSF, the intellectual merit criteria and the broader impacts criteria, so that they can really examine how they might want to change the wording around the criteria, provide some more details around it. Next slide, please. So some of the things we're hoping the National Science Board will be considering are things that came out of these convenings that you can find, again, back to this Evolution of Broader Impacts document. So some things around strengthening the guidelines, Right now, it's, very high level statement. This work must bring, have benefits to society, but perhaps adding some guidelines about the weighting of the intellectual merit versus the broader impacts, some of the expectation around evaluating this work, reporting on this work, strengthen some of those guidelines. So reviewers and people writing proposals really understand what's expected. Another one was clarifying the budget around this. This work is not free. You need to honor your partners when doing this work and understand that they have expenses. They have time that needs to be covered. You're asking them to do work that's important to them, but nonetheless is an additional workload. So how are you budgeting for that appropriately? And then thinking about the review process, preparing reviewers ahead of time to better understand what they should be looking for in broader impacts plans. What are good plans? What are not so good plans? So that they can really review these plans within proposals to the best of their abilities. Next slide, please. And then at the end of the report, there were a number of just recommendations that were aligned with what we talked about guidelines, reporting requirements, diversifying review panels. We talked a little bit about assessment and building infrastructure. So I do encourage you to, when you get the slides, take a look at this report and dig into the details a little bit more. And with that, I will pass it back to Allison to talk about some of the frameworks around this.
Great, thank you. So we've got some of the history, we've got some of the big pictures about why we should be doing this work or why we want to do this work. So we're going to start to transition a little bit into some of the work that we've been doing at University of Arizona and in some of the programs that we work with here, to really think hard about what does it look like to make this part of our research process on, just build it into the work that we do. So we're going to show just some of the thinking that we've gone through to get to our next step in trying to institutionalize some of this. So I'm going to share some of the impact categories and frameworks that are out there. We've just kind of gone through some of NSF's. Here are their impacts categories. The idea here is that the first step in this process is always identifying where are we going? What are the goals that we are trying to address in our research? And we have to be able to name those as a first step in this societal impacts planning and evaluation process. I don't know where we're going. We have if we got there. So NSF's categories, just to very quickly revisit those: inclusion, STEM education, public engagement, societal well-being, STEM workforce, partnerships, national security, economic competitiveness, and infrastructure. So when you're writing an NSF broader impacts plan, the idea is to name one of these categories or impact that you don't think fits this. But you gotta say where you're headed and what your goals are with your research and your broader impacts work. So the next slide, many universities, this is taking this a big step out from NSF and looking at an international framework. Many universities, both in the US and internationally, have decided to use UN Sustainable Development Goals as what they're working towards, those societal goals. And it establishes a common language and a common framework that allows them to sort of pair or align themselves with other institutions around the world. Some are saying we're trying to address all 17 and allowing researchers to identify any of them that they feel like their work meets. Some universities have taken the approach of saying we're going to be a center of excellence in a couple of these sustainable development goals and are really building their research infrastructure around these. There are some really great benefits to having that shared language and sort of an international framework for identifying the goals that we're working towards. We do have a shared language. We can talk to each other really quite easily. We can, if you have somebody from an institution but on affordable energy, you have sort of that common understanding, and then you can compare your research and discuss your research, but you have a shared goal. And again, for universities, it gives them an opportunity to really clearly state how they are contributing to the global community. So some really reasons for using sustainable development goals as our what we're aiming for. We have to be able to name it. So we have goals. We've got to find something that we're working towards. On the next slide, this is another example of those areas of impacts. So research excellence framework is in place in the Kingdom in their higher education research enterprises. They have a mandate. They have requirements for all of the all researchers or research units to be reporting on the societal impacts of their research. And this is their set of impact categories. And as you are assessing your research, as you're doing these every 7-year reports, identify these are the areas in which my research is contributing. So it could be on health and well-being, on social welfare. Maybe you're looking at impacts to commerce and the economy, impacts on production. So this idea of, are you helping industry in some very tangible way? You could also have impacts on the environment. So they're pretty broad categories. I'd hazard a guess that most people could find themselves somewhere in here. You may have to dig a little bit into these descriptions, but they're pretty comprehensive. It's really interesting to think about a system in which this kind of reporting and always thinking about aligning your research with these broad goals is just part of the research enterprise now and as part of academic life. There are costs and benefits of that, but I wanted to share just as one model that's out there. And I should say, before we move on, their system of evaluation of all of the research enterprise and of the academic universities, the impact beyond academia of any particular research unit accounts for 25% of sort of their grade or their assessment in this system. That's how research funds get allocated in this system. So impact is really important. 25% of how your unit is assessed is on the impact that you're having in the world, is part of how you get your research funds in the UK. Next slide. Just another example. I really just like this. I like this figure. I like this model. This is how research in Ireland and University College Dublin is talking about this. Very similar categories. So you can talk about your research aiming to have impact in culture, contributing to people's understanding of ideas and reality, values and beliefs. Maybe it's environmental impact. So you use one of those 9 kind of peach colored categories to identify your goals, where you're heading as part of your assessment. Yes, I contributed to this. What I like is that they've included academic impact in this model, but it makes it clear that it's part of a broader ecosystem. We need the academic impact. That's really important, but it is part and parcel of having broader societal impacts. All right. So this next one, now we're starting to transition to how we have impact. The other 3 frameworks were sort of the idea we're establishing our goals, we're stating our intention for having impact in the world. We want to move the needle in these areas. Lenfest Ocean Program, which falls under the umbrella of Pew Charitable Trusts, is really dedicated to actionable ocean science, and they've really made a commitment in this area. I pulled their model from a recent article of theirs because I really quite liked it, because we start to really get into the descriptions of how we're having impact. So when they're evaluating their programs that they fund, they're looking for how have you contributed to science? That's the pretty standard academic stuff. Oh, how have you contributed to prompting dialogue around these issues, generating discussions, garnering media attention? That all falls under this prompting dialogue. So the sort of next step, we're getting a little broader. Influenced decision-making and management or policy. So we want to see some evidence of that, of the research really having, helping to move the decisions being made in government agencies in particular. And then informed decision-making. So influenced and then informed. And when we get to that informed category, we want to see that there has been direct contribution to a new management measure or policy. So I really like this, getting to that idea of like how we have that impact And then we're going to get a little deeper here on the next slide. And this is a model that Gigi Owen, who is here today, and I have been using in a number of the programs that we work with, and we are now working very much more closely with in the Office of Societal Impact and thinking about how we might use this across campus. And this really emphasizes that how question. We want to have the what, we want to have those goals that we're contributing to, but in order to really understand the kinds of impacts that we're having in the world, we need to be able to chart those, describe them, provide evidence that we are having those impacts. So this top 4 categories here: instrumental impacts, conceptual impacts, capacity building impacts, and connectivity impacts, are all things that that we feel like you can reasonably see within the time span of a research project. We never have enough time for research projects to really go through it. You'll understand that. If you have somewhere between 2 years and 5 years, thinking through an evaluation plan and a societal impacts plan, you may be able to pick up on these things. You may get to see that your research is leading to tangible changes in plans, decisions, practices, or policies. It's showing up in policy. It's being used by makers in real ways. Conceptual impacts: your research can be contributing to changes in people's knowledge about or understanding of the issue that you're talking about. That's pretty reasonable within your research project time frame. Capacity building impacts: we're looking for that next step beyond conceptual. Are we seeing changes in people's skills, expertise, or the resources of the organizations that you're working with? Connectivity impacts really speaks to that trust issue I was talking about before. Are we building partnerships that can be sustained after the lifespan of a project? Trust makes it a whole lot easier for somebody to pick up and use your research down the line. And if we don't have that, we know that it is just far less likely to see use of our research and those impacts that we'd like to see. The bottom category, we like to include socio or environmental impacts. These take a little longer to see. With a good evaluation and monitoring plan, we may get to see them. Sometimes we even see them within that research project lifespan. But those are sort of the culmination of the other 4 that we have, changed attitudes and understandings. We're seeing it in practice and policy, and then hopefully we're seeing changes to social or ecological systems. It's really important to stress that's a longer process, but we can use those medium-term descriptors or indicators. We think we're on the right track towards bigger, more robust, sustainable changes in the long term. And next slide, I think we're now going to talk a little bit about how we've been using this at University of Arizona.
Thanks, Allison. So next we're going to walk through just how we can put some of these frameworks into practice with an example from the institute where I work, which is the Arizona Institute for Resilience, or AIR. So in 2022, Allison and I launched a survey to help document the societal impact of AIR programs. And in that work, we really aim to take some of these processes and frameworks that Allison and I developed for some other projects and programs that we had been working in, to see how we could really scale this up to a broader institute level. So across multiple kinds of projects, different programs with different emphases, research, education, but all of them were housed in the Arizona Institute for Resilience. So we piloted a survey instrument to see if that tool would kind of work to collect some of these societal impacts data across the institute. The survey consisted of 5 sections that asked about the social, ecological problems addressed by the project activities and outputs, impacts across those 5 impact categories that Allison just introduced, and then as contributions made towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we kind of looked at a mix of qualitative and quantitative questions. So there were kind of like multiple choice questions with follow-up questions where people could put in more details and reflections. So overall, from that pilot, we received 12 submissions from AIR affiliated projects, and that's what we're going to kind of present on here. So in this slide, you can see that we counted the Sustainable Development Goal contributions by project across those 12 projects. So, we can see here that AIR programs really reported contributions to climate action, sustainable cities and communities, and then partnerships for the goals was a strong one. And that really focuses on kind of mobilizing resources and capacity building within our institutions. Next slide. And then we also counted project contributions across impact descriptor categories. So, we had AIR projects describe their impact in those 4 short to medium term impact categories. So instrumental, conceptual, capacity building, connectivity. And then 2 projects also described some longer term impacts in that social and ecological impact categories. So, and I should say too, so our impacts here are counted by project, not the number of impacts reported by each project. So if a project reported 2 conceptual impacts, it was really counted as 1. So that's what this is reflecting here. And then next slide, please. We took these 2 sets of categories, so the SDGs and those impact descriptors, and combined them. So on the top, we have these 6 impact descriptor categories, and then down the side, we have these impact goal categories. And the goals running up the side really tell us what AIR programs are contributing to. So in this case, the Sustainable Development Goals. And then across the top is basically the how, or what processes, what steps along the way helped AIR contribute to those larger goals. So the highest number here is in the Sustainable Development Goal 13, climate action. We can see AIR programs reported a high number of conceptual impact contributions to climate action, as well as instrumental impacts and capacity building impacts. And there are also a high number of instrumental and conceptual impacts in SDG 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. So by using this combination, we can really see how AIR projects can map onto those larger international framework goals. But it also tells the story about how AIR projects contribute toward those goals in what processes. Next slide. So conceptually, this slide kind of shows what a societal impacts reporting structure might look like for AIR. And this framework came from an additional process that Allison and I conducted with AIR, also with the help of a graduate student, Elise Otto. We conducted a 5-part workshop series and then also a set of interviews with AIR program leads back in spring of 23. And we did that because some of the feedback from that earlier pilot study that we did the year before was that some of the programs didn't quite feel like they fit into the societal impacts that we were asking about in the survey. They didn't really know how to respond. And as well, AIR was interested in kind of developing some metrics or indicators that would help them measure their progress toward incorporating diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice principles into their work. So we kind of dove into in-depth interviews with the programs, as well as kind of having this interactive exchange over 5 months about how we could tailor this framework to really capture more of the work that's happening in AIR. And we got to this. So we have, we still have some of those big picture goals on the top that help ground AIR programs in that larger international framework, the UN SDGs. So that, again, really allows for comparison and looking across this recognizable set of goals that we can compare with other other institutions that are also working towards those goals. In that second tier, we have an overarching set of the DEIJ related values for AIR. And through those interviews, we found those related to respect and belonging, reciprocity and service, and building community. And then below that, we have our impact descriptors. So some of that supporting evidence that change has occurred and really looking at how that change has occurred, how we're moving towards those values and then towards those SDGs. So, and so some of the, we kind of had to tailor a little bit of this to meet some of those needs of AIR program. So we added in another descriptor category about influencing higher education, kind of reflecting this shift in attitude or culture at the university that allows for researchers who want to do collaborative environmental research, or providing educational opportunities for students in environmental research. We also added or suggested adding an arts-based category to the Sustainable Development Goals to kind of capture some potential new work in the art and science realm that didn't quite fit into some of those others. So kind of the bigger lesson here is that there are several great frameworks out there. They will all kind of need some tailoring and adapting to fit an institution or organization or program's needs. Because, you know, all of the organizations are different and they have different approaches, values, different priorities. So there's definite strength in having some of those common categories across programs, across institutions, but they might not always look exactly the same. There's no kind of cookie cutter type of framework that can be placed on a program or project. It's all going to take a little bit of finessing. And I think if we try to use some of that, the exact same framework for all different projects, we're going to miss some of the point of societal impacts, which is really about meeting the needs of our communities and societies. So as we develop these frameworks for impact, we really need to make sure that they're informed by our partners and the communities where we're hoping to have impact. And I'll pass it back to Allison.
Thanks. So just tee this up perfectly. So what we're working on as our next step is to take some of what we've learned through the literature, looking at other models out there, testing this with AIR and some other programs at University of Arizona, and thinking about how we can develop a tool, like Gigi said, that balance between providing enough structure so that we do start to collect comparable data and some information that helps us understand whether it's an individual project or, you know, a department, a college, all the way up to the institution as a whole, but does allow for enough flexibility that the nuances and the context of each individual project still get to come out, and we're not missing some of those key things that are really related to, you know, impacts to particular communities and things that are really important to those partners. So that's where we are right now, is taking these ideas and saying, what can we develop within Office of Societal Impact and with Gigi that would work as a tool, and as a framework to help both bring people into this conversation, provide some of that additional professional development. As Jen mentioned, many the research community, this is new too, and we really respect that, and on the idea that this is capacity building and this is professional development. We want to bring people into this conversation in ways that that we can help them strengthen their research, strengthen their department, and hopefully strengthen the whole university. So we're working with these three basic elements of societal impacts evaluation and planning. We've got to have those goals. We have to have something we're working towards. Right now, we're looking at the SDGs as a possibility. That's not carved in stone. That can change depending on your department, depending on your institution. It's really important to keep those descriptors so that we understand how and under what conditions we are having that impact, and we can provide that evidence of impact. And then looking at a broad range of formal to informal data sources that can help support the idea that we have those impacts. So that's where right now, this is our next steps, progress, and we're really excited about seeing where we can take this next. And I think that goes back to Jen. Michelle.
Yes. Hi. So I am usually the person who people connect with in the Office of Societal Impact that says, I want to start this. How do I start doing it myself? Where do I start? So I'm going to go over some of those details and considerations when you really want to be intentional about your impact, and how do you do that? So next slide. Okay, one more, please. So I often start with just some questions about how do we get started? And the first one is really to think about approaching it the same way as you approach your research. You really need to be excited about it. You have to bring your creativity and especially your commitment. This is something that you're going to be jumping into with intention. The other idea is to frame your plan as a program, that it's not just a list of activities, it's not a to-do list. This is something that comes together to answer those big questions, just like your research does. And you can think about whether or not you want to create something that's brand new, or are you looking to an existing program or initiative? There might be gaps that you want to fill. You might want to strengthen and expand something that's already working. Or you have a new novel idea and you want to get out there and put it into action. And the last one, oh, sorry, this is not the last one. Think about who you want to partner with and why. That's going to be very important to think about and to explore and to think about early and to make sure it's part of your early planning. And then finally, how will your research connect to your societal or broader impact goals and objectives? What does that look like? What is that main thread that runs from your research and into your impact? That's something that reviewers just really love to see. It makes it very easy for them to follow where you're going. And from that, I'm going to take a small detour here because this last question is typically our jump off point to a related topic of developing your impact identity. So the next slide, this is kind of related questions about developing your impact identity that can happen as you're developing your research identity. And so we kind of talk through some of these questions, discovering what is really important to you. What do you really want to do in society? What are ways that you're hoping to change the world or make the world a better place for someone? So this is part of the beginning of another workshop that you will see coming in spring. We hope to see you there. But it's also based on some of the work of a colleague, Julie Rizian at Oregon State University, who is also very integrally part of the ARIS center and community. So I just wanted to give you an idea of how this is related to developing your impact identity. Next slide. Okay, so a lot of what I do is I ask why. Like, why? What makes you get out of bed every day? What are you excited about? Why did you choose this field of research? Why does your research matter? And why should anybody care about this? Those are really important. And I find it very interesting that some researchers, like, they sort of know, but they've never really sat down and put time into thinking about this. And so they get stuck. They have a hard time answering these questions. Next slide. And so I have a little exercise that helps with this. And it's called our so that statement. And it goes something like, I will do A so that B, so that C, all the way down to get to the end. And I think Jen mentioned this earlier. This is a really helpful exercise to go through to really understand, where am I going with this? I might have an idea, but does it really track with my research? Does it really get me to the end that I want to go to? And so here's just one example that I've had in the past. I'll partner with Girls Who Code, national organization, to offer a coding boot camp for high school teachers so that they can feel more comfortable teaching computer science courses, so that they can encourage more girls to take computer science, so that so that we can have more innovative solutions to society's most pressing issues. And they said, aha, that's where I want to go. I couldn't really make that connection. And that's a really nice, it makes for a nice elevator speech for where you're going as well. Next slide. So sometimes when you're starting to get down into the details of your program, you come to sort of this roadblock or big challenge of, on one hand, you have your passion, your desire, things that you're super excited about doing, and then you have reality, right? And so really being intentional about thinking through both sides of where you want to go. Do your activities align with your why? But also, do they fit within your department or your unit's own mission? Is that something that you have to consider? What is it that you're excited to try, you want to do, you want to expand yourself? But what experience and expertise do you have to put to that? Are there gaps there? What resources are required? And then what resources are available? Is there a gap with that? Will you engage your audience directly? Or will you need to partner with others in order to reach the audience that you want to work with? So these are just questions to think about as you continue putting attention to the details. Next slide. So let's think about that last question about partnerships. So I spend a lot of time talking about partnerships as we've been sort of building up about how important they are. And it's not as easy as going out and saying, hey, you want to be my partner? Looking and finding the right partner, the partner that fits, is really important. And so I often urge people to actually make a list of stakeholders and think broadly about who is interested in seeing this happen, who wants to be a part of this, who benefits, what different perspectives are out there that you have not even thought about, who should be involved that has influence in the community. All of those people are potential partners, and talk to a variety of community voices, even though you think, oh, they may just be tangentially, or maybe that's a conversation later on. I really urge people to have those rich conversations and see what falls out from there. There have been a lot of surprises about the connections that people have made. The third bullet is also really important. As you walk into these conversations, meetings, understand that you're there to also consider your partners, your potential partners, or community needs. You're not just walking in thinking about what needs do I need to fill? What gaps do I have? It's really about where are gaps in your potential partners, in that community that you want to serve or engage. And then identify partners early and onboard them during the planning period. This is not a last stage action item. This is not a last minute thing. And if it has become a last minute step in your planning, thinking about whether or not you need to back up a little bit and think about that next implementation or proposal due date, and whether or not more work needs to be put in order to really understand who is it that I'm partnering with, why, in what ways, how, and what are we coming together around, and making sure that's very clear. Next slide. Okay, I'm going back to this graphic because I really like this. But instead of like you thinking through this on your own, you now have a group or one or two or however many partners that you have that are coming together to think about, do these things align with our why? Does this fit our missions, our one mission, our many missions? What does that look like? What do we want to try to do together? And where is that experience? How is that formed within our collective? What resources are required and available now that we have this larger team coming together? Those become deeper questions. And then again, are these activities appropriate for now this maybe larger or maybe even more well-defined target audience, right? So asking these questions all over again as a collective group. Next slide. So a lot of people think, where do I get these partners? And so I push them to think about your existing relationships. What do you do in the community? What do you do on Saturdays and weekends and evenings and with, significant others? Who are those people that you interact with, right? And start with your personal, professional relationships, things that you do in the community. And that could look like educators. That can look like learners, informal educators. So someone talked about working with their Girl Scout leader because they really wanted to inform more young women around computer science. That's where computer science example came from. Some people have already existing relationships with industry or commercial potential partners. Community leaders, whether they're civic leaders, spiritual leaders, are always very important to reach out to, and then other professionals. All right, next slide. And then also thinking about where do resources lie within your community, within the partners that you're talking with. These are just a few examples, and these photos came from our campus, University of Arizona, but thinking about science centers, poetry or photography centers, lecture series, laboratories, museums, nonprofits, industrial centers, government agencies, right? Municipal agencies, state agencies, tribal nations. You might have connections, or your partners might have connections, and you start building this community that has resources to share. Next slide. So I want to really focus in. So now that you have this idea of like, where do I start? Who might I reach out to? Okay, now I have like this group, and we're excited to get this work done together. There are some really important considerations to think through with your partners. And this is something I do either through focused meetings, I do through workshops, retreats, kickoff meetings, like once you start to get going. But these have all been instrumental in getting the team off onto the right foot. So the first thing we talk about are goals. Pretty much everybody on the team understands like what our goal is. They probably contributed to the proposal. They're pretty well versed in that. However, do we know what my goals are? And do I know what everybody else's personal goals are? That's really not something that we ever put onto the table. However, the way that we make decisions and the way that we prioritize our work happens to be around our own goals, our own personal and professional goals. If we come from another organization, unit, department, discipline, we often also bring goals that are related to those. And they're not talked about or included. And that's one of the first conversations I have a team discuss. From there, we talk about and define very harshly that what is in scope and what is out of scope, because it can be very unclear if people are very passionate about the project. And sometimes it's just a conversation that's something that used to be out of scope. The team can decide they have the time and resources to make that part of the project, but it really should be a team discussion. Being clear about roles and responsibilities as well as expectations. Another big one is risk management. What happens when there's a risk to the team? It becomes a risk to the project and a risk to whether or not the project goals are met. And so having a way to raise issues and to manage them as a team is really important, and making sure that everybody who wants to have a voice has a voice in that. Timelines. Sometimes team projects get snagged with timelines, and they don't consider maybe cycles that are different, like cycles of research, collecting data and publication, don't line up with the way that your own discipline has its own sort of inherent cycles of how research is done, and having a conversation about that. Expectations around communication and meetings, how decisions are made and documented and who gets notified, as well as stakeholder management. How do you bring into those community leaders that you really want to get behind this project and promote it? How are they kept in the loop? So these are some really important conversations that I have with teams once their team is kind of put together. And I use the collaborative project management playbook for multi-organizational teams that was funded by NSF. And at the very center sits the team. And I love that about this. And I find that it is very appropriate for engaged research. Okay, I am turning it over to Allison. Oh, excuse me, not yet. So this is just kind of a time to ponder. How do you know if your work is having the impact that you want it to have? Right? Like, how do you know? You're out there, you're doing the work, you see smiles on faces, you see things happen. But how do you really know? Next page. So more definitively, to what extent do our activities and partnerships produce the intended changes or outcomes in society? Like, that's the big question. Next slide. So sometimes to start with, we think about a program action logic model, and it helps us to put some organization to what we do and what we think we're going to get out of it. So on the very left, we have sort of the situation, the needs, what do we want to do, kind of the higher level, what is the mission and vision and values that we're striving to meet, or the mandates. Under the column under the yellow header of input, that's all the things that go into your project. All the resources that are needed, including time and human resources. The three green columns are your outputs. What comes out of what you do? What do you produce? Who participates? What do they do? And what are some of the things that are going to come out of as you're doing your program? Right. And what the logic is that if you're doing it the way you intended to, the way you thought it was going to come out, you're going to get particular outcomes. And those can be sorted by short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. And it's just a really nice way to lay out your project. It organizes it, and it gives you an idea. What exactly do I assess, and where can I look for these outcomes? All right, so we're gonna advance to the next slide, and I'm handing it over now to Allison.
Thanks, Michelle. So this is really just the idea that when we're working in the realm of these bigger, broader, meatier issues around societal impacts, some of the things that we have learned to think about when we start thinking about those logic models and planning our projects. So just want to start with a few. First, we want to go on to just addressing a problem. We talked about those goals that you want to have, but we need to take that up, not just say, oh, research has to do with one of these topics. What we're really trying to get to, my research is I'm able to connect and contribute in a certain way. We want to contribute to solving a problem. Outputs in and of themselves are not the source of change. Sometimes they can be really nice indicators and things that come out of our projects. They can sort of help us do that work, but just producing a report or an article or even holding a meeting, not the change or the impact in and of itself. And we just need to keep that in mind. What is it about that that has helped us spur that contribution to impact. And finally, the research findings can really help propel change so that the process of doing our research, as Jen mentioned earlier, that act of engagement and collaboration is sometimes how we get our biggest impacts. And with that, Gigi's going to just show you a slightly modified logic model on the next slide that starts to get its.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is the kind of logic model framework that Allison and I developed for evaluating societal impacts in a research context, kind of adapted from that overall action logic model that Michelle just introduced. So, again, for each step, we have specific questions and directions to help researchers think through and outline their impacts. And we start with that societal problem. And then we move into actions and activities. So the methods for engaging with your partners, your project activities. We look at outputs, so those tangible products that you produced. And then we look at, okay, well, how did those actions and activities and outputs lead to some kind of tangible change? So, that's where we have our impact descriptor categories, conceptual, connectivity, et cetera. We look at for whom did things change? So, specifically or broadly, who experienced these changes that were based on your research. And then you can kind of go back and look at how did those documented changes or impacts contribute to addressing that larger societal problem you identified. Next slide. And so there are multiple ways to kind of think through that question of for whom did things change? Your stakeholders or the partners that you're working with? Is it more broadly for students or even more broadly for the general public? But, kind of really thinking through that part of the process offers a lot of opportunity for reflection of, are you actually reaching the people and communities that you hope to reach through your research? And then how do you know? Next slide. And just really briefly, there's lots of ways, so formal and informal, to collect evidence of change. These are just some examples here. But what I really want to emphasize is that you have to think ahead about what you are likely to see in your research, and then think through, how might I collect and save that evidence of change across the course of your research project? So, is it feedback from your partners? Are you looking for reference to your work in a management or policy document? Are you looking for feedback from the general public through surveys or emails? Or are you going to actually do a more formal evaluation of your work with pre-post tests or control trials, et cetera? And I will turn it back over to Jen, I think.
Yep. Thanks, Gigi. So we're going to talk a little bit about resources now that can help you do this work. Next slide, please. And we're going to go back to ARIS, the NSF-funded Center for Advancing Research Impact in Society, which has lots of robust resources to offer you. Next slide, please. So since the inception, they've been offering lots and lots and lots of professional development. These are just some highlights of how many institutions and people they have reached through webinars and summits and conferences and trainings and office hours and a website community. So we'll share their website in a moment, and I really encourage you to explore it. Next slide, please. But they have sort of kind of these three major categories right now that I'll discuss in a little more detail. They have a toolkit and resources on the website to help you in actually developing a BI plan for an NSF proposal. Even though it was designed specifically for BI plans, it can be helpful to any funder who's requesting this kind of work. They have a program that's specifically for institutions to apply for and participate in, called ARIS, that helps institutions build capacity, offices, and staff around this work. And very recently, they have created a certification and micro-credentialing program for professionals who work in this space. Again, it's increasing the professionalization around this work. Next slide, please. So ARIS, the program to enhance organizational research impact capacity. So they're now in their fourth cohort. institutions apply to participate in this program. It's at least a pair of people, someone who would be considered the BI professional who assist faculty and staff and people writing proposals and in doing this work. But then it also has to be attended by an upper level administrator, your VPR, your associate vice president for research, someone who is in a position at the organization to make decisions, to make budget decisions, and to move this work along. So I don't know exactly when the next application cycle opens for the next cohort, but if your institution you think is in a position, is poised to sort of be at this next step, I really encourage you to look at this program more closely. Next slide. So they also have just very recently started this idea of a certification and a micro-credentialing program. They've gone through a pilot testing of the work. They have had researchers and evaluators looking at it. There was a lot of work that went into this ahead of time, thinking about what are the competencies of a broader impacts professional? What sort of knowledge and experience and expertise do they need to have about partnerships, about evaluation, about all the things we've talked about the history of BI, about what other funders are looking for. And so this is an opportunity. ARIS will begin offering workshops so that people, there will be some that's synchronous and asynchronous in doing this work. It's separated into different modules. And this is going to be rolling out really strongly imminently. So if you are a professional in this space, I think it's really worth looking into this, especially if your institution hasn't quite bought into this yet or is beginning to buy into this, or if you might be on the job hunt and looking to join other research development offices and other institutions. This is something that could really serve you well. Next slide. So they also have this broader impacts toolkit, which is a set of resources that you can find on their website. And it ranges from guiding principle documents, checklist, something called the BI Wizard, and a rubric. Next slide, please. So the guiding principles is, interesting. The first version of this document, I was a co-author on when they were NABI, so quite some time ago. Maybe 2014, the original document came out that was sort of just a set of principles as you're writing these proposals, what to include, what to think about, budgeting. They've recently revised that. And so this new version is on their website. And then there's also sort of a checklist. So if you're not diving super deep into this work, you think you know what you're doing, but there is sort of a checklist. So you can go back through your proposal, or if you ask people to do sort of a red team review of your proposal before you submit it, they can look at the checklist and see if you're missing elements or if you've really covered everything that we think is advised to have in a really robust, broader impacts plan. Next slide. But if you really want to dig deeper, there's this broader impacts wizard, which is an interactive tool. Again, it has different modules, it has videos, but it really sort of takes you through the steps in a virtual environment at your own pace of thinking through different elements of your broader impacts plan, everything from budgets to, if you go to the next slide, I think it talks more specifically. But it has these different modules, and you don't have to do them all in the same order, and you can go back and forth. And so you talk about these different elements about who's your audience, who am I engaging, what's the budget, how does this connect to my research, how will I know if it's a successful evaluation, and then putting it all together. And so when you enter your ideas in this BI Wizard online, it shoots out a report at the end of each module that sort of helps you understand how you're doing, and then it kind of allows you to go back. Nothing is saved on the website. It is interactive, but your ideas and your plans are only seen and accessible by you if you use this. And then finally, they have this rubric. So if you do give your proposal beyond the checklist, if you give your proposal to someone to review, or if you use this rubric yourself to look at your plan, it helps to kind of place what a really strong plan is in different categories and what maybe not so strong of a plan looks like. Have you identified specifically who your target audience is? What are their demographics? How many participants? So some of those ideas of going from a very general plan, we're an HSI, so therefore we will engage diverse students. to something very much more specific about, again, numbers, demographics, how you'll recruit participants, all those sorts of things. So it really helps you understand where your plan could use a little more work before you turn in your proposal. Next slide. And so ARIS has conferences. They call it the Summit every single year. The next one has been announced. It's going to be in Omaha, Nebraska in early April. The theme is meeting in the middle or centering partnerships. They have recently opened their call for session proposals. If you'd like to be a presenter at the conference, the registration to just attend the conference isn't quite open yet, but it will be open soon. And ARIS also gives awards to people who really are doing phenomenal work in this space. They are BI champions. There are several levels of awards, so there are also opportunities to nominate yourself or someone that you know that does stellar work in this space for one of those awards. So I couldn't, these conferences are also super fun. They usually partner with a zoo or a science center or some organization. It's just a group that likes to have a lot of fun. So I couldn't encourage you more to check out the summit and see if you're able to attend. So those are ARIS resources. You know, Susan Renoe, who's the executive director of ARIS, these were her slides. I tried to give them the best I could attention, but please go to their website and really explore more deeply. But there are some additional resources. We have our website listed on this slide. We have lots of resources in lots of different areas, everything from using undergraduate research. We have a STEM Learning Center, a Native Peoples Technical Assistance Office if you're working with tribal communities. So lots and lots of resources are on our website around this work. The guidebook that Allison and Gigi developed that was mentioned earlier, the link to that is listed here. A guidebook for an engaged university. And then again, there's many, many more resources on our website. So we encourage you to check all of those out. And as we're wrapping up here, I don't see any currently open questions. Feel free if you want to shoot a quick question into the Q&A. We've been trying to answer them live as we've gone along. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you'd like more information. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. Our contact information is here. And we really appreciate everyone coming today and spending this amount of time with us. We find this work to be really important. I hope you can tell we're really passionate about it. And we are here to support this work in any way possible. So thank you very much. We did record this. We will send out a link to the recording in the next few days when it's available with the slides. And again, feel free to reach out and contact us. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating.